Hi guys, welcome back to Science. If you remember last week, we started looking at soil composition and how the structure of soil is made up. We did a couple of activities trying to see if we could work out where the organic layer of the soil was and where the mineral layer of the soil was. And you went out and tried to dig a hole to see if you could find the organic layer or have a look at it in the mineral layer, or you did some work in the kitchen trying to create a model of, an organic layer or a mineral layer. I also gave you some homework. I asked that you go and try and find out the 3 different types of rock. How did you go with that? Now, if you have a pen and a paper today, that might be kind of handy, because I want you to write down the 3 different types if you weren't able to find them for homework. Now, the 3 different types of rock are igneous rock, sedimentary rock, and metamorphic rock. Today, we're just going to look at igneous and sedimentary rocks. Actually, and we're going to go outside in the field to try and have a look at some of these in a moment. Today, we're predominantly going to look at igneous and sedimentary rocks. The main difference between these 2 types of rocks is that one, igneous rocks, is made from the cooling down of molten magma or lava. So the rock is formed by liquid rock cooling down and solidifying. Now, for those of you who don't know, magma is molten rock that is well below the Earth's surface, a long way down. And a volcano is when that magma comes up to the Earth's surface and spurts out of the top of a mountain. And then we call magma lava. Now, when magma or lava cools, it becomes a rock because it's molten rock as it is. And we have a particular name for that sort of rock, and it's called an igneous rock. We're going to have a bit of a look at an igneous rock today. The other type of rock we're going to look at today is sedimentary rocks. Now, sedimentary rocks, as the name suggests, are made up of sediments. Now, all sediments are ground up bits of other rocks. So what happens is, when you've got all these rocks on the Earth's surface and they bash together, or wind and rain break them down, which is another name for that is erosion. So when wind and rain breaks them down, they erode and become all tiny particles, and we call these tiny particles sediment. What happens with these sediments is they often get washed away. Now, in a natural setting, they get washed away slowly. But if in an environment where it's been disturbed by humans and maybe the vegetation's been removed, they get washed away more quickly. But in either case, erosion occurs and sediments get washed away. Now, when I say they get washed away, they usually get washed to a certain place and they build up there. And so you get this building up of sediments, because over here the rocks have been broken down due to wind and rain, and the rain washes them down and they end up settling in a spot. And that can be usually in a river, in a lake, or in the ocean. So we get sediments building up, and over time they get all compacted and cemented together, and they become this new rock, and we call that rock sedimentary rock because it's made up of sedimentary layers. Now, the really interesting thing with sedimentary layers is we can sometimes get stuff stuck in between the layers or in the layers. And when it gets stuck in those layers, it gets preserved. And then it gets stuck in there, and as the rock's building, it stays in there. And then what happens is, years and years later, we might dig up that sedimentary rock and discover what got stuck in there. Now, we call that thing that's been stuck in there a fossil. Now, it can be an actual thing that gets stuck in there, or it can just be something that got put in there and made an imprint of itself. And that's a very common sort of fossil that we'll find. And other times we can sort of have something in there and it may break down after a while, and we'll have a space in there that gets filled with other things, so it makes like a mould. So we get all sorts of different fossils, but the main thing is in sedimentary rock is where we find fossils, and it's because they're built up over time with lots of sediments lying on top of each other, and occasionally maybe it's just an animal footprint. The footprint goes in and then somehow that gets preserved, and later on we find the footprint. Once we've dug it, it's become a rock, and we dig it up and we discover a footprint in there. Or it could be an actual animal itself that actually gets stuck in there and gets buried, and all the living parts of the animal rots away, and but it leaves an imprint in the rock, and so then many years later, when we happen to dig that rock up, we discover, hey, there's an imprint of an animal that used to exist a long time ago. So sedimentary rocks are quite special like that. That doesn't happen with igneous or metamorphic rocks, okay? Because an igneous rock is formed from molten lava, which is really hot, or molten magma, which is really hot. And anything that falls in that kind of gets melted and all mudged up with it. So you're never going to find a fossil in an igneous rock. So now we're going to go outside and have a look. We're going to have a look at, just revisit the organic layer and the mineral layer. We're going to have a look at what a natural area looks like, and then we're going to have a look at what happens with erosion if an area has been disturbed by people. And we're going to check out sort of maybe if we can see if we can find an animal footprint, and so you can see how we get imprints into sedimentary layers before they become a rock, and then after they become a rock is when we actually break them up and see if we can find any fossils in them. So we're going to have a look at an igneous rock and a sedimentary rock. At the end of it, I want you guys to try to remember how each one was formed, and I'm going to give you another activity to do at home over the holidays. Okay, so let's head outside. So here we have a really good example of where the organic material on top starts to build up an organic layer on the top of the soil. And we can sort of see here it's slightly darker around the top, and then it starts to transition into this mineral layer down the bottom, which is a bit more rocky, and they start to merge in this zone, and this has been created from the bedrock, which has been building up, been broken down, sorry. Now, in this area, we're quite fortunate because you can see up here where it's still intact and been untouched. Whereas this cutting here is because an excavator's come in and it's had a certain amount of human impact. So what we're going to look at next is how erosion is going to take place on an area that's been impacted by humans versus how erosion might occur in a non-impacted place. And that difference is quite important because we're going to look at how this can affect the environment, and it'll affect how soil is built up and how things are broken down. This particular cutting is from a particular rock type called dolerite, and that's one of our igneous rocks. So dolerite is a particular type of igneous rock, as is basalt. So we'll talk about those a little bit more later. So you can see here too how the trees and the other vegetation breaks down and starts to form soil. Here's an old log that's been breaking down and contributing to the organic layer in the soil. Now the other thing vegetation does is helps prevent erosion of the soil. So here we've got a whole bunch of natural native vegetation on the ground. So when the rain comes and the water runs off, the soil doesn't get washed away. Now here's a good example of what happens when you remove the vegetation. You can see that the rain has come, and with no vegetation on top, the rain's hit the rock and the soil and it's washed all the soil away, and it runs away down the hill.
Now here we've got a really good example of an animal footprint in the soil that's been eroded. Now, the interesting part of this is how fossils form. Now, with natural erosion, rocks are always going to be eroded away, and what happens is it forms mud as it erodes as the soil gets washed away, and then either animals will fall in the mud and get stuck there and die, or they'll leave footprints in the mud, just like this one. And sometimes when more mud comes over, that footprint's preserved, or the animal's preserved. Here we have a really good example of an igneous rock. And the difference between an igneous rock and a sedimentary rock is that igneous rocks are made from lava or magma which is cooled, and so it's made up of lots of interlacing crystals, whereas sedimentary rock is made up of layers that are squished together. But this rock is made up from cooling liquid, and so it forms crystals as it cools, and they all interlace, and they're so small, as you can see in this picture, that it's hard to see them as crystals, but they are. So this is an example of an igneous rock called dolerite, and you've probably seen it around quite a bit. It's the same rock that Mount Wellington's made of. So here we've got a really good example of a sedimentary rock. Now, sedimentary rocks are made up of sediments, which are broken down bits of rock that have been eroded away, and the sediments get washed down and they tend to accumulate in a particular spot. And they slowly build up over time, and it builds up in layers. So you can sort of see in this rock, you can find all these different coloured layers, and that's different sediments which have been built up over time on top of each other. Now, these sedimentary layers end up getting compacted and squished together, and they set and they form a sedimentary rock. And sometimes when the layers first lay down, it's still all mudgy, little animals will put a paw print in there, or some animals might even die and fall in there, and then more layers come and bury them. And that's how we end up getting fossils forming in sedimentary rocks, because these animals eventually, all their flesh and everything gets broken down, but their bodies left an imprint in the sediment, and that imprint is what we find later on when we dig up the sedimentary rocks, and we discover that some of these sedimentary layers have imprints in them from animals that died a long time ago, and that's what we call a fossil.